Hello, I'm Sean Lay. Welcome to a programme which brings together some of the UK's leading columnists, BBC specialists and foreign correspondents who file their stories for audiences back home from the Dateline, London. This week, a Dickens of a programme with an election past, an election present and an election still to come, which may be sooner than we think. And we've a spirited panel, even though they're not a panel of spirits. Polly Toynbee's column appears every week in The Guardian, a liberal newspaper in the UK. Jonathan Sacerdoti is a political commentator explaining the UK and Europe to audiences in the Middle East. He also campaigns against anti-Semitism. And with me in the studio, Hugh Pym, who is the BBC's health editor. He's been guiding audiences through the pandemic, as well as all of us in BBC News who rely on the specialist knowledge of Hugh and his team. Welcome to you, Hugh. And to you, Polly and Jonathan. It's good to have you back with us on Dateline. Now, during the 4 years following the referendum here, in which the UK voted to leave the European Union, we used to joke on Dateline that we couldn't wait for the day when we could talk about something other than Brexit. More fool us. Coronavirus, or COVID-19, a label which tags it the year it first emerged, as a global health pandemic, has triggered an economic crisis and is a challenge to politicians that will enhance the reputation of some and destroy others. Here in the UK, what are known as excess deaths are running at a rate not seen since the end of the Second World War. Some who survived the virus are stuck with life-changing effects on their bodies. As for people with other conditions, in England, the number of patients waiting for more than a year has gone from 1,600, just before the pandemic began, to 192,000 now. Hugh, it is an extraordinarily complicated picture. Broadly, though, given the terrible effects this has had in the UK and around the world, how is the UK system bearing up both the health system and the people who are ultimately accountable for it, the governance?
Well, Sean, if you go into hospitals, as I've been privileged to do, along with colleagues, you see the extraordinary dedication of frontline NHS staff working in really difficult conditions, as they are in hospitals in all healthcare systems, but with intensive care patients, the strain and the stress on staff. They went through it all last March and April, then in the autumn, and then now. And it is really, really admirable seeing what is going on there. And the National Health Service, I think we should all be proud of the National Health Service for what it's been doing. The UK is at a very, very important phase in this pandemic, because we've got to the stage where senior health officials are saying that the peak in terms of new cases may have passed in some parts of the southeast of England and London, but you've then got a delayed reaction, as always, in terms of new patients going into hospital and deaths. So we learned from health officials that probably the peak for the NHS is 7 to 10 days away, a lot more pressure there on hospitals. But with deaths, it could take even longer, and you've got to 87,000 deaths now in the UK. And it's a pretty sobering reminder of all this, that death toll could continue to rise, the daily death toll continue going up from here.
And the path out of this, in terms of living with COVID, which we in the UK and people around the world will have to adjust to doing, perhaps for years to come at some level, how kind of treacherous is that path out?
Well, the vaccine rollout has been widely praised for where the UK has got to. More than 3 million actually vaccinated now with the first dose, 300,000 recorded in one day. And there's a target to get to the middle of February where vulnerable groups, the over 70s, care home residents and workers and healthcare workers, will all be vaccinated, about 15 million people. The government will have to be held to account over that. But beyond that, the rollout of the vaccine does offer hope. But this virus will be around for a long time and people will have to get used to a new normal, I think.
Polly Toynbee, you wrote this week about something that people perhaps hadn't even thought about very much in the UK, that election yet to come, which you think might conceivably at least come a little sooner than it has to. You might not think this is much of a backdrop in which to even be thinking about, for any politician who actually wants to keep their job, to be thinking about an election.
Politicians always think about elections all over the world. It's never far from their mind making that calculation. That's the nature of democracy. There is a problem for our government, which, although he has a phenomenal success a year ago in the election with a very large majority, looking ahead to when the next election would be, if he stuck to our fixed terms, which would be in 2024, things will look very grim indeed. Our economic think tanks, our economists are all warning that that is about the time when the government will have to be pulling in its horns, just the time when governments usually want to splurge money on the electorate just before an election. They'll be having to tighten everything up. It'll be a very rough time. Jobs may not have fully recovered. People's personal incomes will only just about get back to where they were then. And a lot of people may be feeling very sore. We will have had, the next 3 years very tough indeed. So the one opportunity might be, if Boris Johnson can really pull off the vaccinations at the pace at which he says he will, and he's given some very firm dates, there will be such true all over the world, such a sigh of relief. It is the one thing that everybody longs for, that will set us all free, or as Hugh Pym says, to some extent, I mean, nothing will quite be normal, but at least much freer than the current very strict lockdown. So it could be that if vaccinations went well, there could be a kind of roaring 20s feeling, a euphoria, everybody rushing out to restaurants, reopening pubs, clubs, dancing in the streets almost. And so in that mood, it might be a good time, the very beginning of next year perhaps, to cash in on that, have an election, and then not to have an election when things economically will be looking very dark. After all, by then people will be saying, how come we both had the worst economic hit in Europe, with sort of 11% hit, and the highest number of deaths and the worst numbers of infections? So it could just be a small window. Don't know if he'll dare take it, but he might.
Well, politicians often dare and certainly risk, Jonathan. But he is a passionate supporter of Boris Johnson, and his idol is Winston Churchill. And that bit of history ought to remind him that you can be standing on the balcony with the King and Queen waving to the VE crowds one day, celebrating victory, and you can be out of Downing Street just a few months later because the electorate decide, great, you won the war, but we want somebody else to fight the peace.
Well, I think, if I may, I think the idea of Boris Johnson planning a flash election at the moment is a bit fanciful. I think it seems like a mixture of wishful thinking and conspiracy theory, or perhaps just a playful framing device for an article complaining about everything he got wrong. I don't know exactly. But I think that he wouldn't necessarily want to call an unnecessary election. I don't think the public would want it. And I realise that, we've all got plenty of complaints about the government, like most people, I certainly do, and how they're handling the pandemic. But I also think that as we live through these extraordinary times, it's worth both taking into account the enormous challenges they're dealing with, and also looking not only at the areas of bad performance, but also where we've done well as a country. The economy contracted by 2.6% in November. That's the first fall after 6 months of significant increases, and it's less than the 5.7% contraction that many expected. The first lockdown in April last year saw an 18.8% contraction in that month, and our economy is 8.5% smaller than it was before that crisis. So I think the government has a lot to deal with, and I think it has acted fast and done whatever was needed as it could. Hasn't always got it right, but no government has. And I think, they spent 280 billion supporting businesses and workers. They protected 9.6 million jobs. They had that job retention scheme. Think about a year back. Who would have imagined a Conservative government paying 80% of the wages of huge numbers of people in this country? And they argue that it's their responsible attitude to spending in the best of times that has allowed them to cope with these worst of times. Now, I will reiterate, I'm not totally happy with every decision the government's making, but I think that most of the broadcast media has scoffed at I think you've lost me.
Polly, let's come back to you because we could hear him, but we've lost the picture. Do you want to just briefly come back on that and we'll move on?
He's quite right that people are cutting a lot of slack to the government and saying this is a very hard time. Who'd want to be running the country at this moment? True all over the world, a very hard time for government. So I think the fact that Labour and Tories are more or less neck and neck in most polls, though Labour has come up hugely from its disastrous last election a year ago under Jeremy Corbyn. Even so, I think there's a lot of anger and distrust now of the government about their failure on testing and tracing. They kept promising moonshots and world-beating this and that. And we're not world-beating. We've been the worst, and we haven't been the most generous in terms of protecting jobs. Some other countries have been much more generous. So how it all falls out at the end of this, I do think that a really successful vaccine operation could wipe out a lot of the painful memories of how badly this government's done. After all, it's had 64 changes to its rules about how far you should lock down, who, where in the country should lock down, left people very confused and very angry about some of the government's own advisors, like Dominic Cummings, failing to keep to the rules themselves and not being punished for it. So there's a mixture of things here. My suggestion there might be an election is only that is certainly a window of hope if all goes well. And I don't think there'll be a great deal of hope later after that.
Well, let's see somewhere that perhaps might just give Boris Johnson cause to be tempted. That's the election present. The country in the lead in the global vaccination stakes is Israel. The first recipient there was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That was 1 month ago. On Thursday, as the 2 millionth dose was injected, Mr Netanyahu was there again, congratulating the woman who received it. In fact, he's been a ubiquitous presence, welcoming deliveries at the airport, visiting vaccination centres across the country. With polling day in March, that election present, he's hoping Israelis notice, which they probably will. There's not much else to do at the moment except watch television. Israel is on its third national lockdown. Jonathan, you're back with us. You heard Benjamin Netanyahu on Thursday saying at that event there's light at the end of the tunnel for Israelis. Do you think perhaps he sees a bit of the light at the end of the tunnel for him too, after what have been very, very difficult months for his premiership?
Look, I feel like you and I have had this conversation before, because every time we come to discuss an Israeli election, and there have been quite a few of them in recent years, I tried to explain why Benjamin Netanyahu, or Bibi as his supporters call him, might actually remain in power, even though much of the Western media likes to demonize him as a far-right bogeyman. The main reason, in short, is he simply isn't that, and many Israelis have been impressed by his leadership. Of course, some aren't. COVID-19 has been an interesting test for him, as I suppose it has been for leaders all around the world. Israel started with incredibly impressive results at containing the spread of the virus, but then went on to lift its lockdown far too quickly, and it saw disastrous results. And now it's doing impressively well again with its vaccination program. And Britain's doing very impressively too with its program. Israel has vaccinated far more of its population than any other country in the world. Sure, it has a relatively small population, but nonetheless, it's acted swiftly and in a very organised way to achieve that. And yes, Netanyahu will be hoping voters remember that when they vote in March. Israel might not have wanted another election, but perhaps the timing of this one has at least helped accelerate that vaccine program. And in this instance, that's a wonderful unexpected side effect, but not of the vaccine, of the democratic process. He's been at the airport welcoming every batch of vaccines in for the cameras, so he's definitely making hay while the sun shines in that regard. But I do remember that more broadly speaking, when he came here in 2018 to the United Kingdom, he gave, one of these stump speeches at every public event he did. And being in the press pack that followed him, I remember one of the things he specifically talked about was the large amount of investment Israel was making under him into digitalizing its health records through the system they have there of social health, but run by different health organizations which compete with each other. So it has the benefits of a private system with, of course, the free at the point of delivery that people need for a social health care system. And by digitalizing it, he made it possible to get all these vaccines, because Pfizer and the other vaccine developers have been delighted to get the data in real time.
OK, and we'll talk to you about potentially what health lesson or not there may be from it. What about the Palestinians? Because healthcare is delegated to the PA and to the Palestinian Authority as far as West Bank and Gaza. But the Oslo Accords are very clear that in a crisis, healthcare is ultimately the responsibility of the Israeli government.
Yeah, there's been a lot of this in the press, and I think it certainly might have helped Israel on the PR front if they'd given vaccines to Palestinians. But the facts, unfortunately, don't always bear out what certain media outlets want to write about it. I think it isn't the responsibility of the Israeli government under the Oslo Accords to look after the health needs of the Palestinians. They have their own health organizations and health ministry. In fact, they didn't ask for those vaccines, certainly in the beginning. Israel has provided a very small number of vaccines to them, which I understand were swallowed up by quite wealthy, influential people. And that's perhaps ultimately what underlines the real problem here, which is that there may be less take-up among Palestinians. There may be less organisation among their own leaders who are trying to get them those vaccines. They said they'd get them through the World Health Organization. And Israel, of course, like every country, wants to prioritise its own citizens. It is vaccinating Palestinian citizens of Israel along with all the other citizens of Israel in order of priority for their health needs.
Toynbee, I'm not going to get into a dispute over what the Oslo Accord said. I noticed the Spectator magazine quoted them as saying it is required to step in as and when it's needed. And I guess a global pandemic might be regarded as the ultimate need. And there is the old thing about it's in all of our interest for everybody to be vaccinated. But just on the point about the impact of this for Benjamin Netanyahu, could it be a way out for him? Because this is not an election he wanted, not one of his choosing. It was essentially forced on him because of the politics of the dispute over the budget, something that under the coalition agreement he signed with the coalition party led by Benny Gantz was supposed to be passed, and he was resistant to being passed.
Well, there's some suggestion he may have wanted an election because he was about to have to hand over the prime ministership to the other part of Benny Gantz, other parts of the coalition, and that it's a good way of stopping that happening. That's possible. He's also facing three criminal separate criminal trials. He's in some trouble. But no, I think the success of the vaccination may well see him home, or at least much better than he would have done before. But I think the interesting thing about COVID is that everywhere it has shone a light on gross inequality in this country, in Israel particularly, perhaps, because the Palestinians haven't been offered the same level or virtually any level of vaccination. And I think everywhere we're seeing that the people who are poorest, the people who have least power, least voice, have done worse. And in this country, it has been not about vaccination, but it has been the poor in the worst living conditions and who work in manual jobs, who've died in the greatest number, and those of ethnic minorities. So we can think of COVID as being quite a cruel searchlight on the nature of the societies we live in.
Hugh, I wanted to just raise this question of what we might learn from Israel. I mean, as Johnson said, it is a remarkable progress of the vaccination record. There's no doubt it's been driven hard by the Prime Minister there. Could it provide something of a model? It's a relatively small country with a relatively small population in global terms, but could it yet provide some sort of model? And could scientists globally learn about COVID because of this programme?
I think the digitisation of health records, as we've been hearing, has been very important, allowing for instant communication in terms of getting the vaccine rolled out, but also allowing data to drug companies to do their research. It has to be said, Israel is well ahead. Then I think you've got the UAE and Bahrain, and then the UK. So the UK has done, if you want to look at this relatively, pretty well. And that is partly down to, or largely down to, the regulatory system in the UK. The MHRA, the regulator, moved swiftly to give approval to the Pfizer vaccine in early December, ahead of other global regulators in the US and Europe. And the UK were criticised for that, moving too quickly. But I think most people would say the MHRA just moved quickly, and then Oxford AstraZeneca as well. So there's been this determination and drive to get them into the system ahead of other European countries, although the US and certainly I think Germany have begun to move more quickly as well.
And we were hearing on overnight Friday into Saturday that the US is now expecting the UK variant, as it's known, to become the dominant strain in the United States by March. We're hearing about a Brazil variant. We have a lockdown beginning on Monday in terms of travel access to the UK without, you will have to have a test or isolated for travelling into the UK. All about these new variants. How much confidence is there that the vaccine so far developed can deal with these new variants?
Well, scientists say, as of now, there is no evidence that any of these variants will be resistant to the vaccine, but they've got to keep monitoring it. The situation is moving so quickly. I mean, with Brazil, there are two variants. One is in the UK, but it's thought not to be particularly problematic. And then there's another one which is much more so, which has appeared in Japan. The UK variant, which is now known in the UK as the Kent variant from the southeast of England, where it first emerged, that was moving very, very fast in December. But the figures for the UK suggesting that cases may be coming down off the peak suggests that the UK variant has been tackled effectively here by lockdown measures. But certainly this issue of variants is a very, very big potential problem longer term, but I think for vaccines, not at the moment.
Hugh, thanks very much. Well, Donald Trump began his 4 years in the White House by having his press secretary pick a fight with the media over just how many people came to watch his inauguration. It wasn't the largest ever, as claimed. This coming Wednesday, though, he may derive some small satisfaction that his successor will probably have the smallest crowd to assemble in Washington, D.C. in modern times. The fear of armed extremists disrupting the inauguration means the biggest group in attendance will be the military and the police. Polly Toynbee, I was in Washington the last time there was a contested election. The election passed had almost been forgotten by Inauguration Day. Everyone was focused on George W. Bush arriving, the governor of Texas, former governor of Texas. It was all rhinestones and Stetsons at the parties. Very, very different this time. Is there a sense that this election past is going to be much harder for America to move beyond?
That's the great question. That's what we don't know. We know America is a deeply divided society. We know that very large numbers of people voted, 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. Are they going to regret their vote, or are they going to still feel cheated? I think it depends a bit how the Republican Party behaves. We're beginning to see some of the most extreme Republicans who went on pretending that this was a stolen election back off. And realised that possibly they were doing huge damage to their country, but also to their party. If the Republican Party returns to something resembling a democratic conservative model, then I think things can be held together. If there go on being significant numbers of people in Congress who are willing to keep stirring it up, keep pretending that this was a stolen election, then I think that's really dangerous. I'm sure we'll get through the inauguration itself. There are now police who weren't there before, army who weren't there before. People are being kept away. But the atmosphere will be alarming and sad, really, that it won't be celebratory, but everybody will be trepidatious about it. But here we have, a thoroughly decent, democratic head of the most important country in the world. All democracies around the world will have heaved a sigh of relief once Joe Biden is sworn in. And we hope we return to having a strong democratic leader of the world who can be a beacon of hope again, instead of somebody who supported dictators everywhere and despised democracies.
Jonathan, you've written extensively about the threat from domestic terrorism. It looks like the FBI think that some of people on the fringes of politics, some of those people had kind of attached themselves to this cause of a stolen election, and that it's unleashed some forces that the kind of system is finding it hard to contain. How big a threat potentially do some of these armed individuals and groups pose?
Well, look, what's interesting to me is all this discussion of violence, who incites it, who carries it out, and who should censor what to avoid it. And I am very concerned about the big technology companies, Apple, Google, Amazon Web Services, and Twitter. And they've all acted to censor President Trump and to remove or shut down their competitor service, Parler, because they say they won't accept the promotion of violence. But, Twitter, for example, has long hosted violent hashtags, kill Trump, assassinate Trump. Only a few weeks ago, Twitter published Iran's so-called supreme leader's threat to Israel, saying the fake Zionist regime will perish. And in, I think, 2018, he described Israel on Twitter as a malignant, cancerous tumour that has to be removed and eradicated. They didn't block him. So they're apparently fine with overt and specific threats of violence like that. And I'll say, however much some people dislike Donald Trump, it's worth remembering that when censorious and illegitimate actions are taken to counter bad people, it sets a precedent for them to be taken against good people. And we don't need to agree on who's good and bad to accept that that's really a worrying precedent for technology companies run by extremely wealthy people who are unelected, unchallengeable by ordinary citizens, to make those decisions about what type of legally expressed news and opinions we can read. It's dangerous and wrong. Now, I don't like how Donald Trump's reacted to losing the election. And the violence we've seen in the US is deeply worrying, as you say, coming from those fringes and potential domestic terrorist fringes. But I don't just mean the storming of the Capitol building. I mean the months of violence and rioting that America's suffered recently. And watching all of it unfold over so many months in a country I have enormous amounts of respect and love for is really unsettling. I think it's vital that any of us who condemn politically motivated violence carried out by people that we disagree with should also condemn violence carried out by those whose politics we agree with. And if we only condemn one side, we're not truly ideologically opposed to violence. We're just political opportunists. And that's true on both sides, left and right. So I think increasingly both sides are guilty of this.
Polly.
Dangerous, both sides are guilty. One really has to be precise. When Donald Trump, when Charlottesville, when neo-Nazis killed somebody and Donald Trump said, oh, well, it's both sides. Very often the violence has been much greater and much more frightening from the Trump supporters, and who are neo-Nazis. They go back with Nazi slogans and swastikas and Confederate flags. That to simply say it's all equivalent with Black Lives Matter, mostly peaceful demonstrations, sometimes a bit of rioting, but nothing on the scale of intentional violence of the Nazis. I think that's actually dishonest, and we have to call out the right things. I completely agree about Iran. Iran should not be allowed to put out death threats to Israel on social media platforms. I completely agree we should have the same standards of threatening violence from wherever it comes in the world. But let's be a bit careful about one kind of demonstration and another.
Let me finally, Hugh, last word, if I may, and just briefly. The biggest challenge, as he's said this weekend, is COVID. How great a challenge. 100 million people to be vaccinated in the first 100 days. You know, it's an easy headline in a sense. Hard for the country to move forward from this thing.
Yes, I mean, I suppose it's hard for all economies, all nations to move forward where there is a particularly high level of COVID. And as we've been discussing during the programme, that so much depends for all these political leaders on how quickly COVID can be brought under control. But I suppose the final thought is, one health official in the UK said this week, the virus is not going to go away. It could become, in a good scenario, like flu, that you have an annual vaccine, but it's not going to go away, and how health systems and governments respond in the next 6 to 9 months will be absolutely crucial. Yeah,
it really is the prospect, and that at least none of our spirits of past, present or future could possibly predict. It would be very unwise to do so. But Polly Toynbee, Jonathan Sacerdoti and Hugh Pym, thank you all very much for being with us, and for you for joining us on Dateline for more prognostications and maybe one or two predictions on the programme same time next week. Goodbye.